Right, I'm just going to introduce tonight's speaker, Cameron. Cameron is a retired automotive engineer who, following his 36th career in product development, has reinvented himself as an independent aviation historian, a long-held passion. He is one of us, volunteers here at the museum. He's been working here for over 4 years as a tour guide, some supporters for the tour guide here, and also STEM ambassador. And he's also known on the rare occasion to don his blue overalls and volunteer for me. Testimony with Mike and Mark, who are in the audience as well tonight. When you go out here and have a little look at the green goddess out there, that's the work that they've been doing over the years. It's actually a beautiful exhibit. The stories Cameron will tell tonight are set in his native Scotland, and to help set the scene, he's going to run a short introductory video. Ladies and gentlemen, Cameron Paterson.
It hasn't broken down yet.
Didn't see the cost, does he?
Did you get back out again? That's the how much?
Right, good evening everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
That's the main first question. Fantastic. Thank you, gentlemen, for inviting me to give this lecture here tonight. Actually, this is the second time I've had the pleasure of delivering this in this room. I did it for the museum's academic lecture series 6 months ago, and there's actually one guy in the room who's come to see it twice. I've never had my own groupie bit, Mark. Thank you very much. Fabulous bit of film there, just to kind of get you in the mood. We filmed that up in the Grampian Mountains last August. Yes, the Land Rover didn't break down. My son, who's a cinematographer, he actually filmed that with a drone. He was sitting in the back seat of the car flying the drone. We'd only had the drone 2 days, and he wasn't quite as good with it. Yes, it was a bit wobbly, but he did a great job, and I'll come back to that story later on. Unfortunately, I've got to do a bit of a health and safety warning. First of all, you know, these days we have to do that. And one very specific warning is that I'm afraid there's a really addictive resource in this presentation, and I'm really worried about triggering people. Particularly when my wife came to the first presentation, this really would have triggered her. So I'm afraid there are lots of maps involved. And you'll see quite a lot of those as we go through. So Darren said who I was, so very briefly. 36 years in the automotive industry, the last 18 of which was with Bentley up in Crewe. Great fun working for them. But I also spent about 25 years in uniform, never full-time, but cadets at school, OTC at university, and then Territorial Army, really, to be specific. I spent quite a lot of time in uniform. Fantastic photograph of me presenting a spanner at a Royal Corps Transport mess dinner. Recently I tried on that mess kit for a fancy dress party, and the strangest thing had happened. It had shrunk in the cupboard. Has anyone ever had that problem? So I spent a fair bit of time in uniform, but I got the chance to take VR from Bentley back in 2020, which I thought about for about 3 seconds. Because frankly, automotive was only ever my profession. Aviation's always been my passion. And I've always wanted to tell stories about aviation, particularly RAF stories. I've now got the chance to do that, and I'm now working as an independent historian. I'm working on a documentary and a book project, and the material tonight is just one chapter of that. And I've picked this Scottish one because it's really close to my heart, a lot of the content in this, but I've also been writing other episodes in different parts of the country. So I take myself off into the hills, looking for where aircraft have crashed. So that's one part of my new journey. Second part, as Darren said, I work here at the museum as a tour guide, and I absolutely love it, and quite a few of my colleagues are here tonight. It's a great thing to do, getting to meet people and talk to them about aircraft. And lastly, I also set myself a goal of learning to fly, and that took me a little bit longer than it would have taken if I'd been a third of my age, but I finally got my PPL last year. So it's been a great experience, but you really need to start when you're a bit younger, is the honest truth. So that's who I am now, and why do I do it? And it's mostly because of this handsome chap here. So this is Pilot Officer Dennis Paterson, who was my dad. Sadly, we lost him a long time ago, and he would have admitted this himself. He was a very ordinary National Service pilot, if there's such a thing as an ordinary National Service pilot, but that's what he did. He was a teenager during the war, Air Cadet. There's a picture on the top left there, working on the engine. I think it's a Fulmar. So he was in the Air Cadets at school. He then joined the OTC at St Andrews University, learned to fly there. There's this lovely publicity shot of some of the pilots, and he then went operational with 28 Squadron Flying Vampires out in Hong Kong. But he only did the kind of statutory 2 years. Then he came back to run his father's engineering business, and he flew Osters for Treble 6 Squadron as a reservist. So a fairly ordinary career, but it inspired me. And he was taking me to air shows and to museums from a very young age, and that's where I got the bug for kind of telling the stories. Now, this is him standing in front of a Vampire in 1952. But after he came back to run the engineering business, we spent a lot of time up here as a family. So this is the photograph you saw at the beginning. This is Loch Lee, up in the Grampian Mountains. Absolutely beautiful place. My mum's family had a cottage there going all the way back to her grandparents, and my dad took it on after he married my mum, and we used to spend every summer as a family in this grotty little cottage. It didn't have running water, it had an Elsan chemical toilet. It was fabulous, but that's what we did every summer all the way through my formative years. But Dad used to disappear for whole days, and we never knew where he was going. He would take himself off for long walks. And it wasn't until a little bit later in life, when he began to take me on the long walks with him, that I discovered what he was doing. And he was seeking out aircraft crash sites. And that's where I first got the bug, and we'll show you some photographs of that later on. So where are we on the map? I promised you lots of maps. So this is the Central Highlands of Scotland. So we've got, Edinburgh and Glasgow is down here. The Highlands starts at the River Tay, So here's the River Tay here, Dundee, by the way, my hometown. So this is the central belt of Scotland. There is, of course, there's another bit up at the top there, but I've deliberately missed that off because nobody actually lives there. Well, that's not strictly true. There are about 250,000 sheep. There's about 500,000 English tourists in camper vans doing their own thing. And there's about 11 million midges. But other than that, nobody lives up at the top. But all the way through World War II in particular and the Cold War, this area was used for flying training. And there are many bases that you will know well, and perhaps some you don't know so well, all the way around the coastline. I think there were 300 bases in Scotland altogether, or 300 airfields in Scotland altogether at one point, rather fewer now. And some well-known RAF stations at Kinloss at the top, Lossiemouth, Scone here, which is where Dad learnt to fly, Lookers, of course, and get that to work there. But there were also a couple of Fleet Air Arm bases. So just up the road from Carnoustie, where we lived, there was what's known as HMS Peewit, which was actually a carrier landing trial station. They had a runway there, but they kitted it out as if it was a carrier, and they used to come and do that there. Also, because it features in some of the stories tonight, is RAF Montrose. And RAF Montrose, little known fact, was the very first operational military airfield in the country. Quite why it ended up being that, but that's the way it was. It opened in 1912, and all the way through World War I. It was a very active station. But the area I'm going to talk about is the area outlined in blue there. But there was a lot of training conducted throughout all of that high ground area, in the area known as the Cairngorms National Park. But I'm going to focus on the area in blue, so let me zoom in on it. And you can see this is that line there. This pointer's not working very well. That's the low ground to the right and the high ground to the left. And you've got two major glens, Glen Clova here, and then Glen Esk going up here. This loch at the top, that's Loch Lee, the pictures you saw at the start. Up in the top left-hand corner, that's the King's Country, quite literally. That's Balmoral Estate. Balmoral is off the top here, but this is Loch Mick. And this is an area of absolute wilderness. It's still fantastic. And sadly, there have been a lot of accidents over there over the years. So let me switch to an Ordnance Survey view. For those map geeks amongst you, this is OS Map 44, just in case you want to go and check. And on this site, you will be staggered to hear, there are no fewer than 27 accident sites that have happened over the years. I've been to many of them, but not all of them. Now the colour coding, red is an accident that happened during World War II. Purple is post-World War II. And you'll notice one pale blue one on there, which was World War I. That was actually a Sopwith camel that went missing from Montrose in 1917 and lay undiscovered for over a year. An extraordinary story. Sadly, the wreck site has gone. We know broadly where it is, but there's no sign of it anymore. I have tried to find it. You'll be very glad to know I'm not going to talk about all 27 of those tonight. I'm just going to talk about 3, and then I'm going to back it up with a couple of stories about local people who were involved in the RAF. So 5 stories to tell. The 3 accidents are firstly a Wellington, secondly a Mosquito, and thirdly the mighty Vulcan. They happened in 1942, 43 and 63 respectively. But before I get into those, I want to jump back a couple of years and tell you the first of the 5 stories. And I've titled this The Few, or A Few of the Few. And it's all to do with 603 Squadron. So 603 Squadron are the City of Edinburgh Squadron. Scotland had 2 main squadrons, 602 Glasgow and 603 Edinburgh. They were based at Turnhouse in Edinburgh. Their motto is Gin ye Dower, which is Scots for if you dare, or in Glasgow, come on, have a go. So very, very brave squadron, and they were actually training in 1940 for what would become the Battle of Britain. And I want to introduce you to 4 characters, and you may or may not have heard of these characters. But these were all Battle of Britain pilots. So you've got Ronald Raspberry, he was aged 23, Gerald Stapleton, South African, who was known as Statme, which is a character from Popeye. There's Richard Hillary, and Robin McGregor Waterston, who was known as Bubble. All young men training for what was become the Battle of Britain. And they were actually part of B Flight, and B Flight were moved from Edinburgh up to Montrose, and they were training out of Montrose in the summer of 1940. And in their downtime, they were offered the opportunity to spend time at the Laird's Lodge. So the Laird is the landowner in that area. He's called Lord Dalhousie. His grandson is still doing that today. And this is his shooting lodge at Invermark, right at the top of the glen, just next to the loch. So he offered the pilots of 603 Squadron the opportunity to come up and relax, to shoot, to fish, do all that kind of country squire stuff. Of those four names, you may only have recognised Richard Hillary. Some of you may have read his quite extraordinary book called The Last Enemy. And Richard Hillary was shot down during the Battle of Britain, very badly burnt. While he was recuperating, he wrote this book. Sadly, he was to die a little bit later in the war. And it's an extraordinary book. It's very beautifully written, very poetic. I don't think it's entirely accurate. He was prone to making a few things up, fake news, I guess we'd call this today, but it is nevertheless a beautiful book. And he dedicates a whole chapter in the book to the experiences he had during their downtime at Invermark. And you'd have thought he would write about the shooting, the fishing and the hunting, these boy sports, but he didn't. What he wrote about was the children. So let me introduce you to a few more characters. And these characters are all known to me. This first character here is Angus Davidson. You're going to hear a bit about Angus as we go through this. Angus is still with us today. He's 95. And Angus was a sheep farmer. But at this time in 1940, he was 8 years old. He had a great friend called Alistair Skene, another fabulous Scottish name. Alistair was also a sheep farmer. He's sadly passed on now. Actually, for a while, he was the face of the Scottish wool industry. So if you saw a newspaper with an advertisement for Scottish wool, it would normally be Alistair who appeared in that. And these two guys, they were born and brought up in the Glen. They were educated in the Glen, but they were just still young boys. They were at the school. But there were quite a number of other kids in the Glen at the same time. And they were kids who had been evacuated from Dundee and from Aberdeen, the two major cities. So kids had been evacuated, as many were. And this is two of them, Bill Davey and Biddy Walker. They didn't know each other beforehand, but they met in the Glen when they were evacuated, and they went on to marry each other. There was also up at the top left, at the top right hand side there, Betty Davey. Now Betty was Bill's sister. And these kids, and there was about 20 of them in total at the school, they all were based in the village, and the village is Tarfside. That's the only village in the Glen. When I say village, it's about 10 houses, it's tiny. And they all actually lived in a house a little bit further up the Glen from there. And they were known in Richard Hillary's book as the children of Tarfside. And Betty Davey in particular, who was, I think, only 7 or 8 at the time, Richard writes very eloquently about this beautiful little girl that really captured his heart. And you might be wondering who the other little girl is on the top right-hand side there. Actually, she was too young to have been part of the children of Tarfside, but I've got to give her a mention because she's my mum. So how did the kids meet these pilots? Well, the answer is at this quite extraordinary event that still happens every year in Tarfside, and it's known as the annual Tarfside Highland Games Picnic and Ball. And it features 3 primary things. The first thing is that there's a games field, and on that games field there's all the usual kind of Highland game nonsense. So there's big hairy men tossing the caber, throwing sheaves of wheat, that kind of stuff. But there's also lots of games for the kids. And these are pictures taken relatively recently. In fact, both my sons feature in those pictures. And this game still goes on today. It's a great event. And you see sack races, those kind of things. The other thing that characterises is that next to the playing field there is a bank. And on this bank You would park the cars and you would sit and watch all the games on the game field below you. These pictures span more than 50 years, but actually you'll see that it doesn't really change very much. The only thing that changes are the cars and the fashions. And I've just been to the games just a couple of years ago, and it's still exactly the same. Talking about fashions, I ought to point out this young lad here in the very fetching blue dungarees and sandals. If you haven't worked it out already, that's me. So the third thing that characterised the games was a very boisterous ceilidh that took place. It's known as the Games Ball. That's far too broad a term, but it took place in this building. This is the Masonic Hall in Tarside. It's really quite a small building. The top floor was the dance hall. It was all lined with wood, and there was a little stage for a live band at the end. And the dancing that went on here was not the genteel dancing that you might get at an Edinburgh ball. This was quite brutal Highland dancing. I remember the sweat running down the walls in the place. It was bizarre. And down at the bottom you see there were 2 doors there. That's 2 bars. Why 2? Because one wasn't enough. But we know for a fact that the Battle of Britain pilots, the 4 guys I showed earlier, they went to the Tarside Games that summer. They went to the ball in the evening. And they met many of the kids, particularly during the games during the day. And in the book, Richard talks about some of the things they got up to. And the first thing is that these pilots would come up and they would play games with the kids, and you can read some of the stories there. Often playing games outside, and these were young men. They were only in their young 20s. They were barely out of their own boyhood. They also told stories in the hayloft, and Angus Davison gave me a quote there that when the midges got too bad, and believe me, they can be dreadful, they would disappear inside to the hayloft, they would tell stories, and in particular Richard Hillary was a great raconteur, and he used to tell stories in German, which was really great for the kids to hear. Thirdly, they also gave unofficial flying displays. Now, of course, they were training for war, and they were training in these hills, that was the whole idea. But frequently they took to flying their Spitfires and Hurricanes up and down the Glen, buzzing the kids, because the kids all got together to watch them. There's a story there about an orange being dropped, and Angus and his pal Gordon McCraw then fought over it. So they were doing lots of things to attract the kids. Fourthly, they did do a bit of fishing and shooting, but bizarrely, for trainee fighter pilots, they didn't seem to like it very much. And apparently Richard Hillary was violently sick when a shot rabbit had to be put out of its misery. And the last thing they did was that they swam and they played in the loch I showed you right at the start. So let me show you a couple of photographs from the time. So this is Bubble Waterston fishing in the loch. But perhaps more interestingly, this is Richard Hillary in a Luftwaffe dinghy. And his pal Stanley Stapleton was shooting into the base of the dinghy with a 2.2 rifle. Boys will be boys. And actually took Billy Davey, who you met earlier on, who was 16 years old at the time. He stepped in and stopped these 2 stupid idiots from trying to shoot each other and drown each other in the water. And that story appears in a number of books. I did a little bit of research because I wondered where this dinghy might have come from. And I'm not 100% certain of this, but I think it came from this aircraft here. So this Heinkel 111 was shot down on October 28, 1939, actually by Archie McCraw, who was a pilot in 602 Squadron, City of Glasgow. But it was the very first German bomber to be shot down on British soil. That's the claim to fame. And we do know that 603 Squadron ended up with a life raft. So it's entirely possible that that is the life raft that's on the loch. But I'm maybe putting 2 and 2 together there and getting far. So that was a halcyon time for these young men who were training to go off to the war. And it was a great time for the kids. And as I say, I knew all of these people. And as I was growing up, we got stories. They told us stories about these pilots and what it was like to see them. And for some of them, life came to an end very quickly. So Bubble Waterston, who dropped the orange out of his Spitfire, was dead less than a month later. He died, he was shot down over London. This is memorial stone to him. And of course Richard Hillary, as I already said, badly burnt having been shot down in a Spitfire. He was desperate to fly again, and after he had recuperated for a year and written that extraordinary book, he was then instructing on Blenheims, and sadly he was to die in a takeoff accident at RAF Charter Hall just outside Edinburgh. So that happened. That's a telegram on that subject. But some of them, the other two did survive. So Raspberry, Ronald Berry, he lived until 2000. A very heavily decorated guy, rose to the rank of Air Commodore. And then the one who survived the longest was Stapney Stapleton, our South African friend. He was awarded the DFC and also the Vliegerkreuz, which is a Dutch medal for bravery. And he was with us until 2010. And he has that quite extraordinary handlebar moustache, wonderful thing. But the story doesn't end there, because thanks to a guy called David Ross, who was also one of the children of Tarside, and who wrote the definitive biography of Richard Hillary, he managed to get Stapney Stapleton back together with some of the children from Tarside. This is a rather poor copy from the local paper. I've blown that up a bit, but on the left you've got Angus Davidson, on the right is David Ross, and in the middle Stapney, still with that fabulous handlebar moustache. Actually, they met up again in 2001, so there was an enduring link there. So that's the first story you'll be glad to hear. So now we are a couple of years later, 1942, and we have Wellington. Of course, we have one of only two Wellingtons here in the museum. The Wellington in question was Lima 7845. She was a Mark 1C. She was built in 1939. Actually, she was a New Zealand aircraft. She was ordered and paid for by the New Zealand Air Force and served with 75 Squadron, New Zealand Squadron. Badly damaged in a landing accident after operations in 1941. And then, like many older aircraft, was auctioned off or pensioned off to be a training aircraft. So she moved to 20 UTU, Operation Training Unit, who were based up at Kinloss. And she was flown by these guys. So the pilot was Flight Sergeant Arthur Keane. He was from Ontario. His wireless operator and gunner was Sergeant Oscar Jensen, who was from Manitoba, another Canadian. The navigator was Joe Weatherson. So Joe was English, got up in North Durham, and he was actually an RFVR pilot. The second pilot, and this is in the days where the Wellington had two pilots, was Sergeant Alfred Kirby, also from Manitoba. He was a farmer. He'd trained as a butter maker, and his plan after all was to go back and run his father's butter farm. And then finally, the only full-time RAF guy on board was Thomas Holman, who was actually from Exeter, so an English guy. So they were the crew that day. And this is what I think they would do. I've had to kind of piece this together. Somebody said Sky Demon. Yes, I unashamedly use Sky Demon for this brilliant bit of software. So they were based up here. It wasn't Kinloss, so it was Lossiemouth, getting my facts wrong. So they took off from Lossiemouth. It was a training flight. The aircraft was having an air test after some maintenance, but they took the opportunity to do a navigation flight. With a little bit of speculation, I think they flew down this way towards Stonehaven, down towards Dundee, and then back over the high ground to Lossiemouth. What we do know is that the aircraft was flying on a heading of about 300, and it crashed about there. What happened? Well, we do know that one of the engine cowlings came adrift, port engine cowling came adrift, fouled the propeller, made the whole thing stop. So the pro pilot was tooling around on one engine. This model of Wellington had the Pegasus engine, which was relatively underpowered for an aircraft of that size. And on one single engine, the pilot apparently tried to put it down on the high plains, right up on the very tops of the hills, but he got it wrong, got too slow, and it stalled into the high ground. Unfortunately, in the accident, the four guys at the front were killed outright. So Keane, Jensen, Weatherson, and Kirby were killed outright, and there was a big fire. But as sometimes happened, the guy sitting in the back, Thomas Holman, got out alive. He actually said afterwards, and here's his quote, that when he realised what was happening, he managed to turn his turret round so that he could being his back against him. He leant back against the doors on the turret, and he survived the impact. He was quite badly hurt. His arm was very badly smashed up, but he was able to get out of the wreckage quite quickly, and he kind of dragged and crawled his way away from the site. And then, as it happened, bizarrely, this guy was flying overhead. So Captain Desmond Huxley, who, as you can see, was 30 years old. So he was a bit too old to be a fighter pilot. He was actually flying for the ATA, Air Transport Auxiliary. Of course, Cosford, here where we're sitting, was a major ATA base during the war. So Desmond Huxley was flying for them. He was actually flying a boat called Defiant. We were talking about Defiance early on, and he was flying it from Lossiemouth down to Edzell. And he was just on a ferry flight. He saw the fire of the burning Wellington. So he flew close overhead, and he saw Thomas Holman crawling away. So he then flew round and round in circles. And he received a commendation for this. You can see that the wording there. And God knows how he managed to do this. But while flying round and round, he was able to write a note explaining to Thomas Holman where to go. And he dropped him the note, a map, cigarettes and matches. Very important to have cigarettes, of course. And he dropped all of those out, which Thomas Holman was then able to pick up. And then he flew. He kept flying his aircraft in the direction that he needed Holman to go to get down into Glen Clover, which was the nearest Glen. And Holman then managed to drag himself down to safety. So Huxley was commended for that, an extraordinary feat of airmanship, really. At the same time, down in Glen Clover on the Cortagh estate, a gamekeeper had heard the accident. He got together a group of people and they went up and they realised there was nothing they could do. Huxley reported it to RAF Scone, which was the central airfield, and the police were sent up. There was no mountain rescue at that stage, and they quickly established that the other 4 guys had perished on the spot. I'll come back to Thomas Holman's story a bit later on. This is a picture of the wreck site a few years after the war. It was all left. Everything's left. This is the middle of bloody nowhere. There's no chance of getting a vehicle there, so the whole of the wreck site was left. At this stage, you can see the fabric has weathered off the Wellington, but most of the rest of it was left. And of course, this happening caused great excitement amongst the aforementioned children of Tough Side. So I'm going to come back to Angus Davis again. Angus was now 10. And when the kids at the school heard about this, Angus and his older brother Sandy, who was only 12, they decided they were going to go to the wreck site. So that's what they did. They didn't tell their mum and dad. They knew the hills well. So they just took off and they trekked out several miles over the hills to the wreck site. And this is what Angus told me. I interviewed him a couple of years ago. This is what he told me about what they did. They got to the wreck site. The guns were still there, staggeringly. So they tried to remove one of the 303 guns from the turret, but they quickly discovered it was too heavy to carry. They were just young lads. Also, as Angus said, he'd have got a right row off his dad if he'd done that. But they did pinch a lot of ammunition. And also, they found lying in the wreckage the escape axe. And there's an escape axe mounted in the rear of all such aircraft. And I had no idea that Angus had this, but he then went and proudly got it. This is that escape axe, which still hangs on his wall. Quite an extraordinary artefact to have. The wreck site was actually little known, but the Bible at the time for people who wanted to go and search aircraft sites was this book by David J. Smith called High Ground Wrecks. I have a well-thumbed copy of it myself. And the picture on the front is clearly that Wellington. It's absolutely, and he says a 20 OTU Wellington in the Highlands, but inside the book, the wreck's not listed. I've no idea why, though, sadly David Longson's dead, so I can't ask him, but he didn't actually list the site in the book. There's hundreds of other sites listed, but not that one. But this is definitely our Wellington. Really hard to see when it's on the hill. Although it's a big aircraft, it's actually hull down in a peat bog. And the only thing you can see from any distance is the tail fin sticking up. And I remember my dad telling me that the way to find this aircraft was to look for a big fence post that probably shouldn't be there. And that's how we found it, and that's how Angus and his brother found it at the time. And in the hot summer of 1976, another couple of intrepid young lads, this time accompanied by their dad, trekked out to the same site. So this is my dad here. That's me, and that's my younger brother. And you can see at the time the wreckage was still pretty complete. That was the first time I'd been out to one of these wrecks. I've got to say that affected me quite deeply, having had a chance to go and do that. And over the years I've been there several times. This is the spring of 1983. I went out with a university friend. I had just got my first SLR camera. And as you can see from the quality of these photographs, I have no bloody idea how to use them. But by this time the wreckage had begun to dwindle. More people were starting to find out about it. There was some illegal removal of wreckage, but there was also some legal removal. And actually some of the wreckage of this aircraft was taken to London and helped in the rebuild of N2980, which is the other Wellington that's down at Brooklyn. So some of the geodetic structure was used to help rebuild that aircraft. So some of it went to good use, some of it went to museums. I went back up again in the summer of 2008, and this is my own son. You can see at this point a few things have happened, so this bit of wreckage has got a lot smaller. It's also now being moved about 200 yards away from the main wreck site. So at some point, somebody, legally or illegally, has tried to move it. It's also now tipped on its side, but that piece is still there today. One of the propellers was taken to what is now the museum at Montrose. As I mentioned earlier, this is actually sitting in the snow, having been brought down by the search and rescue helicopter from Lucas. So what happened to the crew? So the Canadians were all buried locally. There's a lovely little village called Paterson down at the foot of the hills. Paterson has the oldest distillery in Scotland. They have a wonderful whisky called Old Paterson. But this is a lovely burial ground. It sits on the hill. It's a very peaceful place. You will see it in a video again at the end. So the three Canadian guys were buried there together. And some local people went to pay their respects at the funeral, and one of them was a Miss Robertson, and she took time to write this letter to the father of Oscar Jensen, just saying, "I was at the funeral where your son was laid to rest. There would be many other Canadians will no doubt pass on," and of course that was to be the case. So it's a nice remembrance that there were people at the end of this. And there were also local people who took a great interest. The fourth guy who died, Joe Weatherson, I've had the pleasure to meet his nephew, Meredith, and niece Glynis. Unfortunately, they couldn't come to the lecture, but I've been speaking to them. And they gave me a few photographs of Joe. He was repatriated to Hebburn, which is where he grew up in County Durham, and this is his grave. And a colleague of mine called Gary Nelson, another historian, he led Glynis and Meredith up to the wreck, and they've actually planted this memorial at the wreck site today. Sadly, last time we went, it had cracked in two in the wind, so they're hoping to replace it. But that's the only memorial for any of these guys up there, and I'll come back to that at the end. So what happened to our intrepid rear gunner who crawled down the hill? Well, he wasn't allowed to fly again. His arm was so badly broken he was never going to be able to operate guns. But he spent the rest of the war in the RAF. Actually, he was in India helping to build airfields for the RAF over there until the end of the war. He came home, he trained as a painter and decorator. He married Madeline Rostrom, and this is them walking on a boardwalk. She was from Liverpool, and they moved up to the Liverpool area. And he actually ended up working in the Bryington Maze match factory in Liverpool. It's known as the Matchworks. It's a fabulous building, some of you may know of it. And he didn't die till about 10 years ago. Sadly, I never got a chance to speak to him, but I have been speaking to two of his brothers who gave me his dad's story. I was hoping a couple of them might make it tonight. The relatives are not in the room, are they? No, I didn't think so. I was trying to persuade them to come, but they were reluctant, which is understandable. So that's the Wellington. Let's move on to the second of these crash stories, and this is a mosquito. We have a mosquito here in the museum, and this is the aircraft in question and the crew in question. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice two things. One, that it has a civilian registration, Golf Alpha Golf Golf Foxtrot, and it also has a civilian pilot. So Captain Louis Wilkins, who was 39, which was really old for a pilot at the time. He was ex-RAF, and he flew for BOAC. So why was there a mosquito in camouflage flying for BOAC with a civilian pilot? So the answer is because of what was known as the Sweden Air Link, or the diplomatic air link. It was otherwise known as the Sweden Express or the Ball Bearing Run, or even the Stockholm Run. And this is an extraordinary, so some of you I think may know this, but it's worth reading into. Sweden, of course, was neutral, and being a neutral country, Sweden was trading with both sides, trading with Britain and with the Germans. We wanted to keep Sweden on side, so we actually ran through BOAC this diplomatic air link. Mostly what we were interested in was the things that Sweden could sell us that we didn't have enough of ourselves, and primarily that was ball bearings. And most ball bearings came from the company SKF, who were and remain one of the world's leading suppliers of ball bearings. And there is a fabulous book by a guy called Niels Matheson which tells the whole story of the Sweden run. In total, between 1940 and 45, there were 84 aircraft of 15 different types completed nearly 1,900 return flights from Scotland to Stockholm. Most of them were relatively slow transport type things, Hudsons and things like that. And they were a bit vulnerable, to be honest, and the Germans, being not very sporting, were tending to shoot some of them down. So they actually asked for something a little bit faster, and what they were given was 13 mosquitoes. So they were a mix of Mark 3s, Mark 4s and Mark 6s, and they had the great ability of being able to fly high and fast. So they were perfect for this role. 10 of those 13 completed 520 return flights. And as it happens, these pictures, which I took from a modeller's site, happen to be the aircraft in question, GAGG. So let's come back to these pictures. So the picture at the top, this is the aircraft in question, although it's not the night that it crashed. And this is the crew. And you'll notice three more things about this photograph. One, you can see the Speedward logo, so the BOAC and then it was British Airways Speedward logo on the door. You'll also see that the gun ports have been faired over. Obviously the aircraft had to be unarmed because Sweden was a neutral country. And you'll also notice the third thing, there were 3 people in this photograph. Now if you've been in a mosquito, it's unbelievably cramped. So even the cockpit's so narrow that the observer has to sit behind and below the pilot. So how are you going to get 3 people in there? And sometimes they had to have 3. So this is what they did. They would close the bomb bay doors, put a mattress down, and they would carry passengers. And those passengers were all sorts of people. And this is passengers mostly coming from Sweden back to the UK. So there were VIPs, there were industrialists, they were, frankly, agents sometimes. So a lot of it was very, very covert. And what they did with these guys was that they made sure the bomb bay doors were properly locked. They gave them some reading material and a reading light. They gave them a flask of coffee, and they gave them an oxygen supply. Because these aircraft were flying 18 to 20,000 feet normally, where there's not enough oxygen to breathe. And that's what they did. So who were these passengers? So some of them were well known. So Malcolm Sargent, the famous composer, was actually one of the first people to be brought back from Sweden in the bomb bay of a mosquito. But the most famous by far was this bloke. So this is Niels Bohr. So he was a very famous Danish physicist. He was known as the Great Dane. And if you've seen Oppenheimer or you know the Manhattan Project story, he was one of the key people on the Manhattan Project. And he was loaded into a mosquito, not our mosquito as it happened, and he was flown back and he smuggled out of Denmark into Sweden and then back to Lookers in Scotland. But being a very, very clever physicist, he wasn't blessed with a lot of common sense. And when he was given the briefing about what he had to do while he was in the Bombay, he didn't bloody listen, did he? So he remembered the flasks and the sandwiches, but he completely forgot the oxygen supply. So he didn't put his oxygen mask on. So when they got back to Lookers, he was quite unconscious in the Bombay. Fortunately, they had a tailwind that night, and it's a miracle that he survived. He very nearly didn't make it. Actually, afterwards, he just said, that was a fantastic sleep. But you know, history might have been a little bit different if he hadn't made it that night. However, our aircraft on the night in question was not flying with a passenger. It was just the two crew, and it's a mystery what happened on this particular flight, like many of these things. So this is what it should have done. It should have taken off from Lookers. It should have taken a course of about 080 degrees across to Gothenburg in Sweden for refueling, then on to Stockholm, and then back again. That's what it should have done. Our aircraft didn't do that. It set off in an entirely different direction. So it took off from Lookers, and rather than 080, it flew off at about 100. So rather, of course, it got 40 minutes out over the North Sea, and Captain Wilkins must have realised something was wrong because he turned round. But he didn't tell anybody he was turning round. And it was only 13 minutes into his return flight that he eventually radioed Lookers and said that he turned round. He didn't tell them why. Nor did he ask them for a fix. He just asked them for a bearing back to Lookers. And he repeated that request 3 more times on the flight back, only ever asking for a bearing and never for a fix. They could have given him a fix, but they didn't. And it's clear he was quite lost. Both he and the airfield assumed he was back in the Lookers area, but he never made it. And he crashed just after 22:35 that evening, shortly after the last radio call. And I mentioned earlier on there was an aircraft that got lost for a year. This one wasn't quite as bad, but despite an extensive search, this wreckage lay up there with the crew still in it for 3 weeks, which is extraordinary by modern standards. And actually it was found by a guy who was a tremendous character in the Glen. I remember I was terrified of him. He's called Will Stormont, and he was a local gamekeeper, and he was out checking on the grouse, because the grouse season was about to start, and he found the wreckage of the aircraft with the 2 pilots in it. He's alleged, actually, after the pilots had been removed, to try to steal one of the aircraft's tyres. You know the size of a mosquito, that's quite big. And it's alleged that he began to roll it down the hills to try and get it back to his... that may be apocryphal, but that was the story. Sadly, of course, the crew had perished in the accident. These are some photos from the quite comprehensive accident report that was completed. Unlike RAF reports at the time, because there were so many to do, this was classed as a civilian accident, so there was quite a report put together, and these are some photographs of the wreckage lying in what is a godforsaken place, right up on the top of the hills. You can see there British Aircraft BOA Corporation written there. And what does that look like today? Well, staggeringly, there is a lot of wreckage still there. The main bits have gone, particularly the engines have gone, and I've not been able to establish where the engines have gone. They've either been buried, which is possible, or they've been removed to museums at some point. But there is a lot of wreckage left. You'll see that these are not my pictures, these were taken by another fellow historian, Stuart Anthony, in 2017. But lots of bits of wreckage lying here. And remarkably, quite a lot of wood. You imagine that the wood would all have rotted, but it hasn't. You can see chunks of wood still in amongst the wreckage. You've got a pulley system here, you've got a motor there. So there's quite a lot of wreckage left. That video at the beginning of us going up the hill in the Land Rover, we were heading out to the mosquito site. Sadly, when we got out there, the weather was absolutely biblical. It looked fine in the video, but up on the tops it wasn't. The rain was horizontal. We found one piece of wreckage, but unfortunately at that point the weather closed in, and we were not able to find the main crash site, and it wasn't safe. And this is the 3 of us soaked to the skin, just trying to get off the hill. So sadly, I've not been to it yet. So what did the report conclude? Well, it was a bit unusual. It reported that the aircraft was in good condition. It reported that the engines were running at impact. The reason for its abrupt return to Lookers was unknown. The reason for its deviation from the track is unknown, although I think we've got to assume it was to do with the direction instruments on board the aircraft. Mosquito had it was called the DR compass, as well as which was a gyro-driven compass, as well as a backup magnetic compass. It's assumed there must have been a problem with those. And it also had its undercarriage down when it crashed. Why was that? And again, I've speculated as to what that might have been for, but we will never know. So what happened to the two poor chaps? So Louis Wilkins, unusually for the time, was cremated. Actually at Dundee Crematorium, which coincidentally is where my dad was created. And you can see his name on the board there. He was married to Gladys. But I asked to have a look at the book when I went to the crematorium. I looked at the book and I saw the entries. And it was rather sad to read that Gladys never collected his ashes. His ashes were available, but they were never collected, and eventually they were scattered in the rose garden at the crematorium. I'm not going to judge him that was probably a choice that she made at the time, but it's just a sad little segue to it. And his observer, Harold Beaumont, is in the same cemetery up in Fettercairn where the three guys from the Wellington were. So, a little aside at this point, because that's been unrelentingly depressing so far. I want to tell you a little bit more about Angus. We've met him a couple of times. We met him when he was 8. We met him when he was 10. Angus trained as a sheep farmer. His dad was a sheep farmer. He only left the Glen once, and that was to do his national service. He was a Scots Guardsman. This is a dreadful picture, but this is Angus here. But later in his life, when he was working actively as a sheep farmer, he formed the most extraordinary bond with the RAF, and it happened by mistake. And the mistake was that 22 Squadron, which was the search and rescue squadron from Lookers, were doing an exercise. The weather was bad. They put a man on the ground, and they couldn't get him again. So they landed at the nearest farm, which happened to be Angus's, and asked Angus for help to go and get their man who they'd left on the ground. And that first meeting resulted in what can only be described as Highland hospitality. And Angus's brand of Highland hospitality always involves whisky, but often tea as well. And actually you can see Angus took this picture, but there is his wife Ruth. She was a formidable woman, but she is carrying a bottle of whisky, which they often do. And because of this one chance meeting, it became common for the helicopter pilots from 22 Squadron to pop up and visit me. And Angus told me in great delight, and this is his quote here, that he encouraged this. He described it as he used to suck up to them to find out what was happening. So he actually encouraged them to come to visit. And it just grew and grew. And there were Sea Kings used to come every Boxing Day. There were Chinooks used to land in the field out the front. And I remember, because our cottage was actually on Angus's farm, so I can remember as a teenager these bloody helicopters arriving for no apparent reason, the crew bustling inside for a cup of tea, maybe some illegal whiskey, and then heading off again. So Angus really encouraged this. This is another picture from 1981. And that picture's taken outside his house, because the only refuelling that was going on was the aforementioned tea and whiskey. But it got bigger. At one point, there was an American pilot on secondment to 22 Squadron. He thought this was fantastic. So he persuaded his friends to take some American helicopters there. So nuclear carrier USS John F. Kennedy, biggest carrier of the time, was on secondment to Scotland. And this is a terrible picture. This was from the local papers. There's a couple of Seahawk helicopters, I think they are. And they landed on Angus's front lawn. And then all the Americans went in to partake of more of that hospitality. But Angus didn't stop there. He encouraged so many links that he was actually persuading, particularly the Americans, because they're a bit gullible, frankly, he was persuading quite a lot of them to fly up the Glen and pay him a visit, literally. So I remember F-15s coming out of the Glen, which Angus had specifically arranged to come and fly over his house. And at one point, an F-111 came up and did this, and we got this card, or he got this card from Colonel Shirley afterwards saying, "Dear Angus, hope the noise doesn't rattle the wife's china too much." But Angus wanted to go one further. He wanted bigger and better. So he wrote a letter to another friend of his, who's called Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Knott, asking for help. And it's hard to read that letter, but let me read it to you. "Dear Mr. Davison, it is so good to hear from you again. I hope all is well for you in Scotland. Sorry, but I'm unable to offer a B-52 flyover. Believe me, if I could, I would. I might even get in the aircraft myself to see beautiful Scotland from above. I once knew of a B-2 pilot who arranged a fly past of his house in Wisconsin, that's in northwest USA. He was apprehended immediately after landing and then got a remote assignment somewhere. I never heard from him again." So a B-52 never did fly over Angus's house, but he kept trying. And all of this was kind of in the folklore of the Glen, and eventually the local press got hold of it, the Dundee Courier, dreadful newspaper. And in 2019 they actually went and interviewed Angus, and it was all over the local news. And this is a picture from that. And Angus is still with us today. I went with my brother and we interviewed him about all of the stuff I've talked about in 2022. And on the way back from that abortive trip to the Mosquito last August, we went to see him again. He wasn't entirely certain who we were, if we're very honest. He was 95, he's now 95. Sadly, he's in a home after a nasty accident. But I'm doing this lecture a couple of times in Scotland later on this year, and I'm really hoping we'll get a chance to get Angus there if he's fit enough, because it's a great story. Right, one more story to go, and that's the Vulcan. And you know all about the V-Force. They're over our heads here. And one of the key things about the V-Force, as you probably know, is that they were designed to go in at very high altitude, drop their nuclear bombs and run away. And then in 1960, this guy, Gary Powers, was shot down in a U-2 spy plane over Russia at 72,000 feet. And overnight there was a big oh shit moment, because they realised that our nuclear bombers were unbelievably vulnerable to Russian surface-to-air missiles. So the strategy was changed, and instead of going in high, we had to go in low. This is a terrible picture, but broadly, this is what it's about. Instead of going in at 40 to 50,000 feet, they would go in at 200 to 250 feet, pop up, drop their bomb, and then run away again. That had huge implications for the V-Force at the time, particularly had huge implications on the poor air crews who had to learn to fly at very, very low altitudes, which frankly the aircraft were not designed for. And sadly, that's what caused this accident. So we're in June 1963. This is the aircraft in question, X-ray Tel 477, the Vulcan B1A, built in 1958, painted, as you can see, in the anti-flash white that all of the V-Force were painted in at the time. She was flown by Flight Lieutenant David Blackmore. His co-pilot was Derek Falk. His nav plotter was Arthur Roper. His nav radar, by far the oldest guy on the flight at 35, was a guy called Gerald Ross, Scotsman. He was a bit unfortunate. He was actually the squadron navigator. There was always a senior navigator in the squadron. He was the squadron nav. He was actually standing in for Flight Lieutenant James Entage, who had a bad cold and was not able to fly, and that saved his life. So Gerald Ross was in the aircraft instead, and the AEO was John Rodney Chapman. So they were the crew. It's remarkably difficult these days to get hold of photographs of more recent victims, GDPR and things like that. So I haven't actually got photographs of the rest of these guys. I'm still working on it. So this is what they were going to do. This was very typical of a low-level mission that they were required to practice because of this new requirement to go into their targets very early. So they took off from their base. They were based at Coningsby. It was 44 Squadron. And they were to fly up to Fort William at the base of the Great Glen. And they were going to then do 2 loops of this approved, it was called low-level route, BCUK 21R. And it was an established low-level route at the time, and they were going to go around that twice and then fly back. So they took off just before 9 o'clock in the morning. And I've had to take a little bit of a guess as to what their final route was. I've since established it may actually have been more like up here, but this is the Great Glen from Fort William up to Inverness. But what I do know is that just before the accident, they were just over a Boyne, and they were flying on a heading of 200, heading straight for the high ground. They crashed into the high ground at 10:19 that morning. There was an enormous bang, as you can imagine. It was foggy. It was heard by gamekeepers down in Glen Tanner, and one of them set off with his 16-year-old son and a couple of fellow gamekeepers. But they quickly established when they got there was nothing they could do for the poor crew. So let me just elaborate a little bit on the area they crashed. It was right on the high ground in the region of an area known as St Coombs. Aircraft came in from that direction, and this was the impact point, doing something in the region of 250 knots. It actually skipped off a bit of the ground, so the tail actually hit first, and then it went nose first into the relatively shallow hillside, and then of course it just disintegrated. And it left a debris trail about 1 kilometre long. And when I went up to visit this back in 2022 for the most recent time, we actually took some height readings, just out of interest to see how high they were compared to the hill. So they hit the hill here. It continued down over here, and the high ground was just here, and then it dropped away again. And the impact point was at 2,226 feet, and the shoulder that it continued across was 2,252 feet. So it crashed 26 feet below the top of the rise. So it was within its own height of making it over that shoulder. Unfortunately, I suspect even if they had been a little bit higher, it wouldn't have helped, because Hill of Cat over here was substantially higher. So I think they probably would have hit that anyway. As the aircraft was breaking up, it actually knocked down there was a huge fence, a boundary fence between the Aberdeen estate and the estate of Invermark. So they built big fences. I've since discovered that actually it was Angus's great-grandfather who built that fence. So Angus pops up in all these stories. I'm going to tell the rest of the story from the point of view of the mountain rescue guys who had to attend this. And I had the pleasure to meet this guy recently. The RAF, of course, had mountain rescue teams from before the war. And in Scotland there were two, and their primary job, they were set up to rescue down there. That was their original premise. Of course, they got involved in civilian mountain rescue as well, but they were actually set up to recover down Dermot. And there were two in Scotland. There was Kinloss, they handled the north of Scotland, and there was Lookers, who handled the south of Scotland. And this guy here is Neil Daniel, and Neil joined the RAF in 1959. He was actually based at Valley. He was an armourer, and when he was posted to Lookers in 1962, he joined the mountain rescue team there because he loved hill walking and mountaineering. So he joined the mountain rescue team, and both these teams were called out to the accident of the Baltic. It was obviously a major accident. So both mountain rescue teams were called out. It was in Kinloss's area. They had primacy, but Lookers were called out as well because they knew it was going to need two teams. As Neil quite honestly told me, the two teams didn't get on. There was virtually no cooperation between them. They disliked each other on instinct. And when the Kinloss team went to the wrong grid reference, the Lookers team thought this was a great joke, which is, it wouldn't happen today. But there wasn't the cooperation that there perhaps ought to have been between the two mountain rescue teams. So Neil and the guys were some of the first on the scene, and his story of this was pretty harrowing. So they got up to the crash site first because they happened to be closest. They parked their Bedford RL trucks down in the village in Tarfside, and they set up a couple of tents there, and then they took their Land Rovers up the hill. And Neil described to me, he said the first thing that hit them was the smell of aviation fuel. He said it just stank. And actually he admitted he's been to many aircraft crash sites over the years, and the smell of fuel is the thing that they actually look for first. And of course there was an awful lot of it here. Because Kinloss had primacy, they were in charge of securing the site, and it fell to the lookers guys the unenviable task of looking after the crew. Now this would not have been a pleasant experience. Neil did tell me the one thing that stuck out in his mind was he could see the crew lying there. At that time they wore light blue flying suits, and they stuck out on the hillside like a sore thumb. He said he could easily see the crew. He could only see 4 though, because one of them was actually buried under a piece of wreckage. Some, he said, were unrecognisable as people, but the captain of the aircraft was still strapped in his ejection seat. It had been thrown clear, as often happened with these aircraft, and he was there looking just like he was asleep in his ejection seat, but they couldn't move him. And they couldn't move him because they didn't have the pins to make the seat safe. So they had to leave this poor guy in his seat for another 24 hours until somebody went down to lookers, got hold of the requisite pins to come back to make the seats safe. And they then had to remove these poor guys off the hill. They didn't have any specialist equipment. They had no body bags. They didn't even have proper boots and stuff. They had to use sleeping bag liners to move the bodies. But they got them into ambulances, Land Rover ambulances, take them down the hill, and they went back to Aberdeen to the mortuary there. And sadly, the dreadful task of identifying the bodies fell to Flight Lieutenant James Entridge, the guy who had a cold, who missed the flight, was tasked in getting on a train from Coningsby all the way up to Aberdeen to identify his dead crewmates. So hideous, really. Really sobering part of the story. And Neil admitted to me that that was his first accident, and it stays with him to this day. This was the other team, and I got access to the Mountain Rescue Team photo archive, and in there I found these pictures. So this is the Kinloss team, and they were based at Balochan Farm, and they were all up at the site for 2 days, together with the Lucas team. Then they all moved away, and they were replaced by a crash guard from RAF Buchan, just north of Aberdeen. And the crash guard were just a bunch of soldiers who really had no better idea. They were left there to guard the aircraft. One of them actually wandered off during the night and got lost. So they had to call out the Mountain Rescue Team again to go and find him. And then what happened was that once they'd removed most of the critical stuff, they just left the wreckage there. It was about 3 weeks before what was known as the Crash and Smash team would arrive with their big heavy vehicles to try and drag away the stuff or bury it. Also in the photo archive I found these rather sobering photographs that the Mountain Rescue Team took of the wreckage, including, you can tell this is a Vulcan. Here's your port, engine intake, and the list, very spooky. But in that intervening 3 weeks, Dennis Paterson, my dad, again, was in the Glen with a few of his pals, and they knew the status of this, so he went up there, 4 of them in an old Willys Jeep, and they took this extraordinary series of photographs, and I only found these in his slide collection after he died. I had no idea that he'd taken these. And all of the major elements of the wreckage were still there. So there's the starboard intake. Here's an Olympus engine buried in the peak. The engines, of course, were several hundred yards ahead of the rest of the aircraft. They were catapulted forward. There's a shoe on the wings, wreckage scattered all over the hillside. This is burnt out wing. The guy standing on the aircraft, a really unusual chap called Sandy Buchan. He was the Lord Provost of Brechin, that's Scotland's equivalent of a mayor. He was permanently pissed, Sandy Buchan, complete alcoholic. And he wore the kilt all the time, bizarre guy. But here he is again, just over here, he's holding a life raft he found. And there's Alistair Skene, the sheep farmer that you met earlier on, he was there. So it's all these same people cropping up again. Another colleague, Gary Nelson, another historian, he's been to over 300 crash sites in Scotland, and he's catalogued a lot of photographs. This photograph here is actually the impact point. This is where the nose of the Vulcan hit. So there is a Vulcan-shaped indentation on the hill where its nose hit. I sent him those photographs, and he then, in the course of the day, he actually positioned each photograph. So he went to each position and filmed it as it is today. So that was the 1963 shot, and this is what it looks like today. And he did that with a whole bunch of them. I'll run through them quickly, just as an interesting kind of before and after. Back in 2022, as I mentioned, we went up there with my brother David, and we were inspecting the fence that was demolished by the aircraft. So this was this big fence. You can see that it was torn out of the ground as the aircraft went through there. And we also went to look for the wreckage pit. So although they removed the big bits, a lot of stuff, they just dug holes and buried it. And there's quite a few wreckage pits around the hills. As you can see, there was snow on the ground that day. It was really unpleasant. But this is one of the pits. You can see all the wiring there. But what we also did, this is the impact point again. This is the direction of travel. What we did, and I always do this, I carry Royal British Legion little poppy crosses in my rucksack. So whenever I go to an accident site, and many other guys do this too, I'm not a particularly religious guy, but I always plant a cross and kind of take a few minutes to remember the crew. And sadly, there are no other memorials for many of these guys, but hold that thought. So what did the accident report say? Well, it was pretty bloody damning, the accident report. These were the headlines. The prime cause of the accident is that in normal flight, the aircraft was flown into high ground when it was 1,565 feet below the briefed height. It was as brutal as that. There's actually an area in the accident report that said who was to blame. You can work that out yourself. I don't need to show it to you. Actually, I also know that they were about 3 miles off course, but frankly, it wouldn't have made any difference. Weather was potentially a factor, but they were doing something that was relatively new to them, and they paid the price. Sadly, there have been lots of similar accidents over the years. This was a big moment in kind of local history. There hadn't been a major accident up there for years, so the P&J, the Press and Journal, Aberdeen's local paper, had this major headline. As I mentioned, I didn't get a chance to find out very much about the crew, with one exception, and that was the AEO, John Chapman. About 11 years ago, his daughter got in touch with me through another historian, asking to see my dad's pictures. As it happened, they were posted on a website in Scotland. Her name was Kate, and when I did this lecture back in October, she was here in the room with her cousin. So it was really nice to have relatives in the room. She told me a little bit about her dad, who she never really knew. He'd been in the RAF for a while. He was really unusual in that he served on Valiant, Victor, and Vulcan. So he served on all three of the V Force as an AEO. This is him here, dashing young chap. As it happens in this picture, this is him up here, but the guy sitting in the front here is the guy who would go on to pilot the aircraft that crashed, David Blackmore. He married Rosemary, and he then had 2 daughters, Kate, who I've already mentioned, and her older sister, Chantel. Chantel sadly passed away recently, but it was really nice that Kate was able to come along. And she told me a little bit about what it had been like for her mother in particular. And back in 2014, she sent me this quote, talking about the effect that the accident and the sudden loss of her father had on the family. And that sounds as if they were treated really harshly by the RAF. No, actually, that wasn't the case. Yes, she was asked to leave the base, and that was because she was the only married widow, if you like, on the base, and she didn't want to be there anymore. So it was actually her decision, but Kate had perhaps quoted it poorly to me. But when we were then speaking just last year again, she sent me this other beautiful quote that I have to share with you verbatim. And this was about the effect of losing her father on the whole family. And I'll let you read that, because it kind of captures the sudden loss. So when Kate first got in touch with me, I was able to offer something to her, which you wouldn't normally get the chance to do, and that was a piece of the aircraft. Now, one of the things when a turbine jet aircraft crashes, one of the things you get is thousands and thousands of turbine blades all over the hillside. Here's a couple that my colleague Gary had recovered. If they're lying out in the open or they're in a wet bit of peat, they will corrode pretty quickly. But if they're buried deep in the peat and there's no moisture in them, they recover well. And as it happened, my dad, when he was up there in the pictures you saw earlier, he recovered this fairly large blade from the Vulcan, which had been deep in the peat, and it was in fantastic condition, albeit bent. And we've had it in the family ever since. And when Kate first got in touch, I offered her the blade as a part of the aircraft that her father was killed in, and she gratefully accepted it. And actually, they brought it here when they came to the lecture back in October, and that was a nice thing to have done. So what happened to the rest of them? So David Blackmore, the pilot, also married. He was buried in Newport. Arthur Roper, also married. He was also buried in the same cemetery at Newport near Lincoln. Derek Folk was buried near his family home down in Sevenoaks. And lastly, our poor unfortunate squadron navigator Gerald Goss was laid to rest up at Fordertain, Strathpeffer, up in the Highlands. So that's all you'll be glad to hear. There's a few people I would like to thank. I'm not going to go through that, but a few people have helped me to put this together. But there is one key next step that you may or may not choose to help me with. I'm really bothered that there isn't a memorial to all these guys. There are some local little ones, as I've showed you, but there's no memorial to the guys lost in that area. So I'd like to put that right, if at all possible. And I've taken the inspiration from what's called the Cheviot Memorial. So the Cheviot up in Northumberland. There are 18 crash sites in that particular area of hills. And over the years, they have created this wonderful memorial to everybody that was lost in the 18 accidents that happened over the years. So I'm trying to generate some interest to do something similar, called the Angus Glens Aviation Memorial. I've got principal permission from the landowner to do it. And we're going. So my plea to you is, if any of you got any experience at this, please let me know, because this is kind of a new field. That was a story about people. Lots of different people known to me, people strangers to me. But sadly, most of those people are no longer with us. So what I'd like to do in closing is just show you another video so that we can remember them in a Scottish way.
Well done.
Thank you for indulging me through those stories. Any questions?
Oh, we have one. Yeah, go on.
Have you approached the lottery fund?
No, I haven't. I haven't.
Because I was involved in setting up a memorial for an American pilot, and we got money through the lottery funding during the millennium
Okay.
period. It was a bit complicated, but it was done in the end.
Okay. Well, thank you. I will look into that.
Yeah.
I assume they're on the National Memorial Arboretum wall, aren't they?
They are, and of course people killed in training were not included in casualty statistics during the war, as you probably know, but at least they are now all included, also the IBBC, Bomber Command Memorial, so they're all listed on there. So at least yes, they are recorded, they're just not recorded locally, which I think is something that could be put there.
Cameron, excuse me. Did you get involved with any crash sites in Wales?
I've been to a few. I'm hoping there'll be a number of episodes of this. I've already finished writing one based in the Peak District, because of course there's lots up there, and I'm actually working on that as a lecture too. I'm thinking about which sites in Wales would be suitable. I've been to a few.
Yeah. There's quite a few, I think.
There are quite a few. I need to find a group of them in a kind of similar vicinity. But yes, I've been to a few. There's an extraordinary mosquito one up there, where the armour plating behind the pilot came adrift during the accident and is wedged in a rock. And it's about the only bit of wreckage that's left. It's so wedged in that fortunately it will never be moved. So it's kind of a memorial of itself.
Cameron, you said at the beginning you'd been to most of the sites that you show on that map of the crosses.
Yeah.
So how many have you yet to go to, and are you planning to go there?
Planning to, yes. Many of them are grouped together very closely. Actually, there's 6 of them on one hillside called the Hill of Wirral. But I've not managed to find them all, because some of them there's so little wreckage left that unless you have a 10-digit grid reference, you've got virtually this. 6-digit grid reference often isn't enough. But yes, I've got quite a few to find yet. I'm up there very regularly visiting my mum, but it takes time to go and do that. But yes, I do hope to eventually get there.
Do you find that the survivor records are confusing, to say the least?
Absolutely, yeah.
MOD.
Yeah, and I say for the Vulcan crew, I could find almost nothing. Really, really difficult. I managed to get the accident report, but it was redacted. So it's okay for World War II stuff. If you can get hold of the accident reports, it's quite good. But yeah, it's really difficult. It's fascinating.
I found out very early on in my researches that the Americans couldn't spell Welsh names.
You don't need to say Welsh names, the Americans just can't spell. Any other questions?
I think it's quite interesting, actually, the bit about the welcoming from the firemen. Because you don't get that in Wales, do we? Yeah. They paint little logos on their roofing pilots.
No, interesting. I completely forgot to mention this. There was a new volunteer here, and I don't think he's in the room, but there's a volunteer here who had worked on 22 Squadron. And I met him after the first lecture, and he remembered landing in Angus's Field.
Oh, wow.